As time goes on, there seems to be less new stories and more retellings, remakes, remasters, reboots, prequels, sequels, and spin-offs than anything else. Certainly more than wholly original stories. And as creativity seemingly dwindles, so too does our hope in worthwhile content. But it's hard to deny that when we see one of our favorite franchises returning in some way, especially after a long hiatus, that a little part of us can experience, at the very least, a little bit of excitement. Had I been younger and had Disney not purchased Star Wars, I would be bouncing off the walls at the prospects of a Boba Fett series, one of the most visually appealing character designs in all of Star Wars, in my very biased opinion. I also recall being exactly that excited at the prospects of a Halo movie, when it was rumored Peter Jackson would be leading the project, and that was at what many might consider the height of Bungie's Halo. Nowadays, many find they don't feel that same excitement they have in the past when hearing rumors and gossip of projects like that beginning to stir. Part of it is undeniably oversaturation. As I said a moment ago, there are far more redos of old than comings of new, and that alone can lead to burnout quickly enough, and the more there is, the faster we get to that state of burnout. Aside from that, I think another significant factor is the mentality surrounding these returning franchises, and how sometimes our over-specific expectations and passion towards these projects can lead us down that unfortunate path of inevitable disappointment. One thing that will almost always guarantee a one-way ticket to that disappointment is not recognizing that adaptation can coexist with inspiration and artistic freedom, and not understanding that not all adaptations are required to be 100% accurate to the source material being adapted. In fact, I imagine most artists want to express their creative freedom, even when tasked to create within the limitations of an adaptation. According to Merriam-Webster, adaptation is a noun defined as 1. Something that is adapted, or specifically, a composition rewritten into a new form. 2. The act or process of adapting, or the state of being adapted. And 3. The adjustment to environmental conditions. Examples being a screen adaptation of a novel and adaptation to changing circumstances. For further context, just to avoid any potential confusion, Merriam-Webster defines adapt as a verb as 1. To make fit, as for a new use, often by modification, and 2. To become adapted. Examples being adapt the curriculum to students' needs and adapt to a new environment. Nowhere in these definitions, most importantly the first one, is it stated that an adaptation need be a one-to-one recreation of what is being adapted. In fact, in the definition of adapt, it specifies often by modification. Recently, it seems when showrunners and directors have been tasked with an adaptation, they do so following all three definitions of the word at once. The retelling is of course an adaptation of the story and characters from the source material, but it is simultaneously deviating from that source material in order to change according to the environment, with the environment in this context meaning the circumstance of its creation. Those circumstances potentially being creative limitations imposed by studio heads, who are ultimately the ones in charge, personal biases of the showrunners and writers, or everyone's favorite, the social and political climate, reducing media to what some consider propaganda, or any number of other things that could influence a writer to deviate from the original source material. So why is it that there are so many complaints when an adapted work isn't a perfect one-to-one recreation? I see nearly every announcement or debut of a new series or movie that pulls from a pre-existing or established source getting a similar treatment, which is usually something along the lines of, it doesn't follow the lore. This criticism, of course, comes in many forms and has been directed at many different franchises over the years. And I'm here to argue that not all are deserving of that criticism, or at least that it isn't appropriate criticism for all adapted pieces of media. The first time I saw this and really began to realize what was happening was with the announcement and growing marketing leading up to the release of Amazon's The Rings of Power. Now, I admittedly and unfortunately have not yet read any of Tolkien's work myself. The books are on my list though, I promise. But as things are now, I'm not the person to argue for lore consistency, at least not in the context of this franchise. However, that is not a point that needs to be argued in the first place. With that ongoing marketing campaign and interviews in abundance, there seemed to be some initial confusion on what exactly the series would be leading up to the eventual release. Though in time it did become clear that this show was not going to follow the Tolkien mythos one-to-one. The showrunners, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, eventually conceded and admitted that the Rings of Power would not be an entirely loyal to source material adaptation, or recreation, of what they had the rights to, that being the appendices to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Where Amazon surely hoped only excitement would be multiplying, alongside this admittance of a non-faithful adaptation, instead grew a preemptive disappointment and dissatisfaction with the series. Complaints echoing off of each other from all directions saying, "That's not how it is in the books." Now let me be explicitly clear in saying I am not defending the Rings of Power in any way. Season 1 has a plethora of inconsistencies, painfully poor writing, and severely underdeveloped characters. The point I am making here is that those are the things that need to be the focus of the criticism. Calling attention to the fact that the series doesn't stay true to the lore, when the showrunners have directly said it will not, is needless and ultimately a waste of time. I don't know if it's a straw man in trying to make the showrunners seem like enemies of true Tolkien fans, which I have heard them described as, or if it's a laziness-driven red herring in trying to focus on what the show doesn't do, meaning follow the source material, instead of focusing on the actual show itself, which, funnily enough, is a much better argument for it being of low quality than the lack of lore accuracy. The showrunners have more or less admitted that what they've created is nothing more than fanfiction. They just so happen to have the rights to do so, meaning they can make it with officiality, and thanks to Amazon with an astronomically high budget that is far beyond reason. In Forbes' article, The Rings of Power is making a mockery of Tolkien's work, Eric Kane says, "It's not so much that Amazon has fiddled with the lore, it's that the show's writers and creators have told a story that simply wears the trappings of Middle-earth." And I find that an excellent wording of the real issue, because ultimately the lore accuracy, or lack thereof, isn't what matters. At the end of the day, or I guess at the end of the series, nothing from the books will be impacted or unwritten or made obsolete. It's not a replacement or continuation of anything. If you were looking for lore, then you would read the books. It was not the job of the showrunners to expand on or add to the lore. What the series did aim to do was tell a story simply inspired by the Tolkien works they had the rights to, but to ultimately tell their own story, and then make sure it was watered down, easily digestible and accessible, and that it looked, felt, and sounded enough like The Lord of the Rings to the wider general audience. Meaning, if you've watched this far into the video and enjoy thinking critically about media like I do, then you're probably not in that target demographic. And I say probably because it is of course absolutely acceptable to enjoy content that isn't of the highest quality. I like plenty of low-quality movies, and when I was a kid I used to watch those really bad sci-fi original movies on TV with my mom all the time, and I loved those. They were bad, but I loved them anyways. So I'm not saying you're wrong for enjoying Rings of Power, if in fact you do. I'm just saying it's unfortunate that what we did end up getting was executed so poorly. But I won't go into those specific details here, since if I went on a tangent analyzing the consistency and writing quality, this video would probably be over 5 hours long, and that's not what this video is about. Another case of this, which I won't go into nearly as much detail with, is Netflix's The Witcher. The series is not and was never intended to be a completely faithful recreation of the books. In the mega article, Why the Showrunner for The Witcher Initially Said No to Netflix, by Elise Illigan, she recounts a roundtable interview with Lauren S. Hissrich, The Witcher showrunner, and her saying, "I'm not a fantasy writer. I don't think I'm the right person to honor this. I don't know if I can give the fans what they want." And Netflix said, "Don't worry about the fans. Remember, tell us the story that you would tell." Again, many have needlessly criticized the series for its lack of lore accuracy, when in actuality the true issues are with the inconsistent pacing and the shortcomings in character development. The quality of writing simply isn't up to par. And that's not the sole fault of there being discrepancies between new and original. It's the fact that those discrepancies led to flawed or broken characters and a terribly inconsistent pace scene to scene, with abrupt transitions across a timeline that viewers couldn't easily keep track of. As I said earlier about the Rings of Power, the series doesn't replace the books. The series doesn't replace the games either, the same way the games didn't replace the books. It in no way replaces or unwrites anything that came before it. If you're looking for lore, it's in the books, unharmed, where it will always be. The series was likely made for a new audience, perhaps for those unfamiliar with the franchise, or maybe just a more casual audience. Another quick and final example is the Paramount Plus Halo series. And this is a simple one because the showrunners openly stated the series takes place within an entirely new timeline. According to the IGN article, Halo TV show's timeline is still rooted in canon by Matt Purslow. The show will not take place in the timeline of the video games, and instead uses a newly formed Silver timeline. It just comes from a different perspective. Now I'm just waiting for someone to say the 343 games are their own timeline too. Joking, but not really. But this means the show doesn't impact the games, and the games don't impact the show, not in any meaningful way, other than the games being the sole influence for the show, of course. So for those wanting original lore-accurate content, we have the games, and the books, and the comics, and for whoever the show was made for, they have that now. So arguing that the series' portrayal of Master Chief is wrong and not the real Chief, well, he literally is not. He is an entirely different character, as it's an entirely different timeline. He just has the same name and armor. To make those arguments, you need only reference him in Halo 4 and 5, as those are direct sequels with inconsistent portrayals of what is supposedly the same character. The Rings of Power, The Witcher, and the Halo series are just a few examples of when a franchise gets some type of adaptation or new content that doesn't cause any continuity or lore discrepancies, as it's not a continuation or rewrite, at least in the sense of a replacement. There are no retcons happening. It's basically fan fiction that leaves the source material unaffected. So now I want to talk a little bit about Star Wars, a franchise that has had its lore and continuity muddied with new additions, and it unfortunately has happened non-stop since the Disney acquisition. Unlike these other franchises, Disney didn't have the decency or respect towards Star Wars to make something truly separate of, or detached, from what had been established prior. Through their acquisition, they erased all of what was previously canon, expanded universe, and essentially began cannibalizing it. Most books and comics have basically been discarded, and the ones that weren't thrown away have been picked apart and made into new and altogether inferior pieces of media that directly impact what was left intact following the purge. Everything Disney has released for Star Wars, with the exception of Visions, has been official canon, meaning the original timeline has been continued. Characters have devolved, and entire arcs and storylines have been made obsolete. Anakin is no longer the chosen one. Rey is. Luke is no longer the most powerful Jedi, nor is he the leader of a new, better Jedi Order than what was before. Han forgot all he learned, turned his back on Leia, Luke, the New Republic, despite being a general, and his own son, just to be a low-life smuggler again. And of course, he took Chewie with him. The entirety of the sequel trilogy and beyond is character assassination on repeat. And unfortunately, the shows aren't immune to this symptom either. Ahsoka, the most recent Star Wars series released, at least in relation to me writing this script, tells of the return to power of one of the biggest galactic threats following the fall of the Empire, Grand Admiral Thrawn, whose character writing is depressingly subpar in the series. Not only did they adapt a character incredibly ineffectively, similar to the other examples like in Rings of Power and so on, but they put that massacred adaptation into an existing timeline. A timeline where, for example, Luke Skywalker should be at his most powerful and most prominent in the galaxy, yet he is completely absent. until further official canon is released explaining where Luke is and what he's been doing all this time, throughout all these shows with all these huge looming and growing threats. We have every reason to believe they keep leaving him out because they just deem him inadequate. Since if the excuse was that he was busy doing more important things, why wouldn't they make a series about those more important things instead of what we got? I would much rather see Luke fight an even bigger threat on his own adventure than watch Ahsoka and Sabine bumble around each other, talk to some Purrgil, and then fail at keeping Thrawn in another galaxy, when literally doing nothing would have been more effective than what they ended up doing. They seem to have no use for Luke, but when he appears in The Mandalorian, Chapter 16, or Season 2, Episode 8, The Rescue, he shows up like an absolute unit and dismantles everything in front of him to get to Grogu, who we have reason to believe he sensed through the Force and was able to track him down using that alone. So why is it that Luke is powerful enough to basically just walk through such formidable enemies and strong enough with the Force to find Grogu from however far away in the galaxy, but can't sense when Ahsoka is in danger? Why couldn't he sense that Thrawn was about to make his return? Why is he, the most important and powerful character in the Star Wars universe at that point in the timeline, missing? It certainly can't be foreshadowing the sequel trilogy, can it? Luke is just one example, of course, as even the character writing for Ahsoka and Sabine seemed to be inconsistent from where we left them off at the end of Rebels. But I don't want to go into too much detail there, as, like I said before, if I got into that tangent, this video would be multiple hours long. Basically, all of this very brief example has been around Luke, Thrawn, and Ahsoka very generally. But to make another quick point, Obi-Wan is undeniably the worst offender when it comes to character impact, inconsistency, and overall character assassination, at least within the context of series, not movies, because Luke, of course, takes that spot. But that show doesn't even need to be discussed, as its problems are out in plain sight for all to see, so I'll spare it. For now, at least. Writers, showrunners, and the associated studios need to either be more explicit when they aren't following source material, or aren't writing into an existing timeline or universe. And if they are going to write into pre-existing source material, they need to make sure they do it right. The best option, of course, is to just make new original stories, instead of constantly using things that have already been done, and very likely done better than whatever the end result of the adaptation could achieve. Unfortunately, we know that Hollywood as a whole, and basically no production company, is interested in new franchises, as they're much harder to sell than something recognizable or that already has an interested or dedicated fan base. We all know people are more likely to consume another Amazon Rings of Power, as opposed to insert generic fantasy title here story by John Doe that no one has ever heard of before. It's no secret that existing franchises are much more financially reliable than taking a chance on something new, even if that's what the audience wants. Ultimately, we need to make sure that when we criticize or analyze something, we are judging it by its own merits, not by how similar it is to something else, even if that thing is an adaptation of that something else. The only time it should be acceptable to critique from that standpoint is if perfect recreation was the sole intention, and if that intention was clearly communicated to the audience. If a film adaptation of a book aims to perfectly recreate the book, but then deviates in meaningful ways, it has failed its goal, and it should be highlighted when criticized. If a film adaptation of a book aims to tell its own story, and is more so just inspired by the original work, then those deviations have no reason to be judged for being deviations, as recreation was never the intention of that adaptation. In looking for reference material while I was writing this script, I found the channel Random Film Talk, and in the beginning of his video analysis of the first episode of Rings of Power, he makes this point beautifully.
Deviations from the source material are perfectly fine, provided they are done specifically and deliberately to enhance the story being told in a way that makes sense, or to simplify it due to the various limitations posed by translating the work from page to screen. I am not interested in how accurately or inaccurately Rings of Power adapts Tolkien's source material. What I am interested in is how Rings of Power succeeds or fails to tell its own story, and how it does or does not follow the rules that it lays out for itself.
Which, now that I think about it, is really just an extremely efficient way of saying what I have taken basically this whole video to say. It's not about being a perfect recreation of the source material, especially when the creators make clear that is not the intention. It's about the overall quality of the piece of media in question itself, and how well it stands on its own. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope my points on the importance of distinguishing between adaptation as inspiration or recreation were clear. Although I know I went on a few tangents, and I hope the Star Wars rant towards the end wasn't too annoying. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and whether or not you feel adaptations should follow the source material exactly, or if they should have the freedom to tell their own stories. I'd honestly love to get a discussion going, as I'm genuinely curious as to what people think an adaptation should be. Most of what I have seen online is that adaptations should be perfect recreations, which is really why I wanted to make this video in the first place. Anyways, thanks again for sticking around, especially if you made it here to the end. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and I hope to see you next time.